Starmer doesn't, to me, have an idea. I once said to somebody who is very close to him, "Come on, you know him deeply. Tell me, like, if you peel away everything and you get to his core, like, what is it that fundamentally drives him?" And they said, "Oh, he's a social democrat." I thought, well, that's not the thing that burns in your soul. Nobody's driven on by being a moderate social democrat. Somebody else says, it's human rights. Let's see.
It's been almost 10 years since Britain's referendum to leave the European Union, since Brexit. Now, I know what you're thinking, Aaron. It's in the past. It's happened. It's behind us for good or bad. We don't want to talk about it anymore. Here's the thing, though. If Nigel Farage is the bookmaker's favourite to be the next Prime Minister, maybe we have to. And maybe we should start examining why Brexit happens, regarding it less as a spasm that came from nowhere and the culmination of a series of events, both intellectual and political, which had been building for 80 years. Britain, a century ago, was the largest empire in history. For my entire life, and that of your parents as well, it's been a country looking for a role in the world. Brexit was meant to open doors, but so far, it seems only to have closed them. A new book talking about all of that, Between the Waves, the hidden history of a very British revolution, I think is the best book on Brexit so far. It starts in the 1940s in North Africa, chronicling the likes of Enoch Powell, Jean Monnet, and takes us through a cast of characters through Thatcher, Blair, all the way through to Sir Keir Starmer. Tom McTague is its author. He's the new editor at The New Statesman. Tom, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks so much for having me.
We have you on because you've written this fabulous book. I know I say that. I've never had somebody on the show and said it's an awful book, because we just wouldn't interview the person, obviously. But it is genuinely fabulous, interesting, very well researched. Between the Waves, the hidden history of a very British revolution. It's about Britain's exit from the EU, but it starts in 1945, or even earlier, in fact. Many people watching this or listening will be very political, and they'll have been very interested in Brexit for a very long time. But now in 2025, they're thinking, that's all behind us, thank God. Why on earth have you written a book about Brexit so long after it's happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I began thinking about this probably 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, and then started writing it 4 years ago. You and I were talking off air about this. I've had children in between, and I found myself sort of digging like further and further into it. And I think this is kind of the origin story of the book in a way, that when I pitched it as a version of a Rick Perlstein book. There's Rick Perlstein, the guy who did like Before the Storm, Nixon Land, Reagan Land. And he sort of charted the conservative revolution in the States. And there was this amazing introduction in Before the Storm where he talks about Barry Goldwater winning the Republican nomination in 1964. And he sort of sets it up like the Republican Party did what nobody thought they would ever do. They elected a conservative. And I'm reading this thinking, from our perspective now, when we, the idea of the Republican Party and conservatism is like synonymous. You wouldn't think that they could be sort of pulled apart. But then you're taken into that world where there's conservative wings of the Democrats and the Republicans. So he takes you into this sort of different place, a different mindset. And he says, they elected a conservative, and then he went down to this landslide defeat to Lyndon Johnson. And everybody says, that's it for conservatism in America. And he kind of lists the people who made these predictions. And they said, I think there was one, it's either from New York Times or The Atlantic or somewhere like that. And they say, if the Republican Party decides to become a conservative party, it's finished in America. It'll never win again. And then he just says, from that point on, you then get governorships fall to conservatives. You eventually get Reagan in California. And then, Reagan wins the presidency. And essentially the arc of his story is that Bill Clinton sues for peace and sort of says, all right, you've won. And I thought, God, that is, you could tell a similar story of the Brexiteers, the Eurosceptics, that they lost and lost and lost again. And in my memory, that that story that Pearlstein sets out feels very much like 97. I remember those headlines suggesting that the Tories would never win again in Britain. And Euroscepticism was somehow synonymous with sort of madness, a mad electoral strategy. And if they pursue that, they are necessarily out of date and therefore will lose. And Blairism is the future. The only way to win is centrism. And I just thought, God, I've witnessed the same story that he's telling in a way, and I should tell it. And the interesting thing for me about the Pearlstein accounts was that he's not a conservative. He's a sort of liberal author, but he is writing about a conservative revolution. But the books, as I understand them, are very popular among progressive Democrats, those on the left of the Democratic Party, who kind of see in the books the importance of ideas, campaigning, sort of not accepting ideas of inevitability. And I did have an ambition that I could try to write something that wasn't trying to judge Brexit, but was trying to understand how history changes, how politics works, how people can win, even if they're losing elections.
I mean, this is something I want to talk about later on, but, you know, I feel relatively well immersed in the intellectual history of modern conservatism in this country, but you still bring these biases, which is that the left is better than the right when it comes to campaigning, deep politics, you know, this idea of marching through the institutions and so on, is still very heavily associated with the left, the liberal left, and that the right is powered by big money, you know, true to some extent, has massive influence within legacy media and tied up with media ownership again in this country. You know, I think that's kind of an argument, at least with the papers in this country over the last 40 years. Of course, the BBC is a significant counterweight. But reading the sort of the stories of various individuals in the book, some of whom I'd heard of before, some of whom I hadn't, but even people like Roger Scruton, who I had heard of, I wasn't really aware of just how formidable a campaigner he was. And, you know, in my head, as I'm reading his story and the various exploits he's getting up to, I'm thinking this guy is Britain's Antonio Gramsci, right? I mean, not in terms of his sort of theoretical contribution to how you create change, but as someone who personifies that ideal politically of engaging in intellectual cultural production, but also doing activism, trying to tie them up, thinking in a very long-term way. Is that fair? Do you see, let's start with Scruton in that way, and then do you think the left has kind of misunderstood the Eurosceptic British conservative movement?
Absolutely, on both counts. I think Scruton becomes a kind of central character in this story for lots of reasons. But again, it's kind of, I found myself sort of peeling layers back, you know. So in the original pitch for the book, it would start in 1990 with Thatcher's removal. I had this image of her in Chequers. She spends New Year's Eve 1989 in Chequers, and it's at that point where she seems to sort of be losing control. And history is kind of starting to run past her, like run away from her. You know, she's fighting against German unification. She's fighting against British membership of the ERM. She's losing control in cabinet. She's losing control on the world stage. You know, she's falling out of influence in the White House. And I kind of liked that place, but then I thought you have to go further back. You know, you have to think about the Bruges speech, and then you have to think about the Single European Act. And I just kept going. And you do see this character, Scruton, kind of would just kept appearing. And you'd have conversations with somebody like Daniel Hernan, the Eurosceptic Tory peer now, who was once a Eurosceptic Tory MEP. And he had this close relationship with Scruton. And he was telling me about a time where they were trying to set up the forerunner to what becomes Vote Leave. And they're doing it at this country house in Norfolk. And it's him and it's Matthew Elliott who goes on to run the Vote Leave campaign. And there's Roger Scruton who's there. So he's there at the kind of the genesis of organisationally of Vote Leave and what becomes Brexit. But then he kind of recurs through the story as you trace it back. And he's there in this important place, I think, in the 70s and 80s. 1975 is where I think I I really introduce him. I do talk about him a bit in 68 and the riots in Paris. But he really comes to prominence in 75. And again, it's this moment, I think, and this is, I suppose, becomes a kind of theme in the book, that history doesn't work and politics doesn't work in just this sort of win elections and you win. There is this kind of, as you put it, sort of organizational fight back that happens kind of ideologically and through the institutions, and he's trying to do both. And the story where he comes in is Margaret Thatcher's election as Conservative Party leader in 1975. Now, from our perspective now, we obviously see this as a moment where the right start to take control. Back then, she was seen in some ways as, just another figure from the failed Heath government. She'd signed up to all of his policies. She'd supported his entry into Europe. Enoch Powell, another figure that we'll probably talk about, he dismisses her as, if you want change, why would you vote for this moderate, who backed everything that went wrong as they saw it. So Scruton supports the candidacy of a guy called Hugh Fraser, who stands for the leadership from the right, criticising Thatcher and the others for being sort of sellouts in a sense. And he gets destroyed. He gets 15 votes, and he thinks he's going to get around 30, but he thinks he's going to, he's standing for an older version of Toryism. And his supporters are Scruton and Jonathan Aitken, who's his organiser in Parliament, and then John Casey, another Conservative academic. And when they lose, they come together and they say, well, let's have a kind of, let's try and keep this going somehow, these ideas that we have of an older kind of romantic Toryism. And so they organise a Hugh Fraser Appreciation Society, and that becomes a kind of dinner club. But then Scruton says, no, I want it to be about ideas and philosophy. And he turns it into the Conservative Philosophy Group. Now that then becomes quite a quietly influential group where the likes of Powell and Oakeshott and in time, figures like Richard Nixon and others will then come and speak at this event. Hayekian economists. And so you start to have this place. And then Thatcher starts to come in as well, and she asks to join. So you start to have something. And I just think it's moments like that where you're starting to sort of take the temperature of a kind of shift. And what they're trying to do is that, and I think it's a conservative philosopher from Cambridge, Maurice Cowling, who puts this. He says, we were trying to shift the country out of the groove that it had been running in since 1945. That was their task. And the way Scruton saw it, it kind of had, you did it through the newspapers, you did it through ideas, and you did it through the institutions. But they kind of all came together.
Yeah. And I think reading that and you repeating that kind of reaffirms that obviously ideas really matter. I think people on the left really get that. People on the right get that. As you say, the sort of some of the biggest fans of this idea of the Goldwater campaign inaugurating, the modern era. Yeah. It's something that I think the left is really into for understandable reasons, because it shows a story of how the periphery can define the centre over many decades. But the people who seem the least interested in that story are centrists. And even in 2024, you have people around Keir Starmer insisting that ideas don't matter, when they clearly do, both in the short and the long term. On Thatcher and Scruton, why does, I don't know, we're talking about the EU, but she is the seismic figure. Why does she start to listen to those people? Is that a case of somebody who's in power, has influence, looking around for ideas and just grabbing one? Because obviously it's quite interesting that they back somebody else and then they gravitate towards Thatcher, and of course she basically ends up personifying many of their ideas, not all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think she just grabs an idea because she's looking for it. She's looking for ideas and ideology, a coherence, I guess, or a support that she can she can push back against the left. I think there is a moment where she says, the left have ideas and ideology. Why don't we?
And is that when she's the leader of the party after 75 or before?
I'm trying to remember now. I think it's around that time. It's around the time. I think she says that in a conservative philosophy group, or it certainly becomes part of the kind of collective memory of the people in the conservative philosophy group that that she is there and she says those things. And there is this moment actually, which I think is fascinating, where she's debating with Enoch Powell, and Enoch Powell says somebody makes a case for nuclear weapons, and she says that she would deploy nuclear weapons for British values, for values, and Powell says nonsense. I would, what does he say? He says something along the lines of, I would support and fight for Britain, whether it had a communist government or a conservative government, and that is Toryism. And what Thatcher represented, according to the sort of her more conservative detractors, is a form of almost Whiggish republicanism, American-style republicanism, talking about linking whether you support something or not to values rather than to sort of the territory that you represent. And I think that captures something as well with Thatcher, that there are clearly tensions in who she is. And also with Scruton. Scruton is dismissed by some of his other conservative intellectual colleagues like Michael Oakeshott as obsessing about having an ideology when Tories and Conservatives don't have an ideology. It's about sort of practical management of your country's interests, and so they sort of hold him in sort of slightly this tease him in a way of almost being a bit foreign, a bit sort of either European or American in fixating on ideas. But I think it's probably why, in a sense, that Scruton has become, and Powell and Thatcher, through three figures who have become the most dominant now. If you talk to young conservatives today, those are the people that they sort of obsess about. It's the ones that have a kind of idea and an ideology that's beyond kind of sort of traditional Toryism.
I want to talk about Powell in a moment because, again, I've read Simon Heffer's biography, which is cited here frequently, but this really conveys his force as a historical and intellectual figure on the right over a very long period of time. Before we talk about Powell, though, I just want to say, with Thatcher, and I think this is really important for our audience to sort of reckon with, and maybe you have some thoughts on this too. She wins the 1975 leadership. I think she had one backer in the shadow cabinet, I believe, which was Keith Joseph, I think.
Yeah, I'd have to check.
I didn't read that here. I read that at previous time, maybe inaccurate, but that's what I read. She certainly wasn't supported by much of the establishment press and so on.
No bit of the Tory press apart from the Spectator.
And yet she won. And I sort of said this a lot when Jeremy Corbyn was Labour leader, and that's not to sort of champion Corbyn or say that, oh, what if? But people were saying immediately post 2019 it could never have worked. And I said Thatcher was in the exact same situation. She was really disliked by lots of her own party. Nobody gave her a chance. She had absolutely no influence within the press on her side. She became the most transformational politician in this country after the Second World War. Like that's kind of what it takes. Somebody has done that before. So this kind of fatalism I see on the left, which is, we could never do it because we don't have the kind of institutional resources that the centre does. Thatcher didn't.
I agree. I think Thatcher is, and this is in a sense why she's always been a figure that fascinates people on the left because if you speak to somebody like Ed Miliband, he will sort of be drawn to her, not sort of in support, but as this figure that provides a model for how a transformative left-wing government could be. I think the difference is, and I remember I didn't quite answer your question before about Europe and Thatcher, is that she skillfully manages to come from the old centre of the party and then to sort of move into a more radical place. So in a sense, I guess Corbyn always came from further away from from the centre. I guess she would be more like a kind of more, I suppose, more like an Ed Miliband or somebody, but then
maybe a Burnham.
Gripped. Maybe a Burnham, we'll see. But yeah, perhaps. Certainly, because Burnham gets a lot of flack, doesn't he? Because he was once he was once a Blairite. He was a Blairite spat, or he was a Blairite member of a Blairite government. Hangam and Burnham, wasn't it? Or whatever the phrase is around him. But that was what was how they criticised Thatcher. I think the key thing with Thatcher and her grabbing on, she was looking for ideological coherence, but I think she had clear Tory instincts, and they were, in a sense, Eurosceptic before Eurosceptic became a term. And that isn't undermined by the fact that she supported British entry, or she campaigned in 1975 for Britain to remain. There's a great moment where she is said to have been watching the anti-campaign, the Leave campaign in 1975, and she kind of goes, "Oh, that was good, wasn't it?" And she kind of believes in it. But what's hanging over all of this is the Cold War.
Yeah.
And for Thatcher and the Thatcherites, as they became, and for most Conservatives at that time, that was the overarching number one foreign policy issue. It was a defining issue. And Europe, being a part of Europe, was considered a kind of core part of that of that mission, to be anti-Soviet Union, to be hawkish, to be patriotic in a sense, as they saw, and to be pro-American. It all involved being pro-European. So you have these kind of figures, these grandees that become skeptical in time, Eurosceptic in time, who are pro-European because it's seen as synonymous. The absolutely crucial thing when she goes in 1990, and sort of that period from 88 to 1990, absolutely crucial, is that the Cold War comes to an end. So this overarching organizing principle of British life disappears. And so Euroscepticism almost has this kind of space to breathe from that point. And I would argue with Thatcher, I think there is a consistency, but she does in ideological consistency to her. I think she was always skeptical in a she was cynical about Europe. There's scenes of the French president responding to her or writing about her, saying, "God, she hates us. She wants out," from the very beginning. But I think it kind of finds its voice towards the end as the conditions allow it, as Europe changes and geopolitics change.
Yeah, there's in terms of Thatcherite rhetoric, there's a quote from her where she's talking about the winter of discontent, I think, and shortly before she's elected as Prime Minister, and she says something to the effect of, "It's all very well wanting a quiet life. You can't even get a quiet burial."
That's it.
Because of course the grave diggers were on strike. And I've got my footnote, just genius. She was a genius, so it's okay to say that. I don't really agree with very much with what she did. But
Do you find it odd? I mean, I find that on TikTok now, she is now being sort of pushed into my feed constantly. She's become, and you watch the clips of her in the same way, say you read the speeches of Michael Foot,
yeah,
and you go, God, this was a different age where, she was, she had a kind of, obviously she had a kind of astonishing presence. And I think it's that you start to see on TikTok. So you do wonder, it's like, how would she do in today's politics?
The kids call it aura, don't they? Aura farming. She absolutely had it, and somebody else who had it, and again, I don't really agree with very much of what they did politically or said politically, was Enoch Powell. I want to go back to that Cold War point because it's really important in a minute, but let's talk about another war, which is World War II. People are listening or watching and they think this is fascinating, and they're thinking, EU or European Economic Community. Of course, that starts in 57, 58. You start this book in 1943?
42.
42?
Yeah.
Why?
So it was part of this process that I was mentioning earlier about where do I start this book, and this became my biggest problem really when I began. And I thought about 1990, and then I had a conversation with a friend Tom Holland, the guy from Rest Is History, and he said to me something that stuck with me. And you've probably already lived this yourself, but he said, "Don't think that you just have to kind of dip your toe into writing books. Like, don't think that you just have to try a small idea out first, and then you've got this bigger idea in the back of your head, the most ambitious book. So just start with that." And so this would play on my mind as I was thinking about when to start. And there was another book alongside the Rick Perlstein book by a guy called Hugo Young, the Guardian journalist. He wrote a tremendous book called This Blessed Plot. And it comes out in 1998. And that tells the entire story of Britain's relationship with Europe. And he starts it in 45. And it is brilliant, but it has this like fundamental problem when you read it today, which is that he has an intro where he says, Britain's destiny was to be in Europe, as proven by the fact of our membership. And he's writing in 1998 when sort of visions of the end of history are kind of everywhere. And that's his argument. And it's kind of circular argument even then, but it felt truer then. It felt that history was moving in this kind of inevitable direction. But obviously from our vantage point, and you're thinking, well, that's evidently not true. History is going in a completely different direction to the way Hugo would have thought about it, or Tony Blair, his great hope. He saw in Tony Blair the first proper pro-European prime minister since Edward Heath. And so I thought, I think all of that needs retelling, in a sense, from the vantage point of today, now that we know that we're out. And so you go back through the moments, 1975 referendum, 73 when we go in, 71 when we have the first vote to go in. Then I was thinking Enoch Powell, 68, Rivers of Blood speech, the centrality of immigration to our eventual the eventual referendum, surely, and his influence over figures like Nigel Farage. I've got to tell that story, so I've got to think about 68. And I just sort of traced it back, and then I arrived at this moment where four figures are all in the same place at the same time, and they are also figures, in a sense, as you were putting it at the start of this conversation, who shape politics. Without elections. They shape politics and history in a completely different way. And they are Jean Monnet, the founding father of Europe, Enoch Powell, Harold Macmillan, and Charles de Gaulle. And they're all in Algiers in North Africa in 1942. Same place, same time. And I thought that was remarkable in itself and hadn't been explored. But the reason they were there tells us something about history as well and how it moves, I think. And what had happened is the Allies, Britain and America, had invaded North Africa to push the Germans out of North Africa. And they had a problem, which was that the French forces there were loyal still to the Vichy regime. And so they didn't want to fight hundreds of thousands of French forces, well-armed, well-equipped. That would have been a total nightmare. So the Americans, there was all sorts of plots to try and impose somebody as a leader who could stand down the French forces, but that didn't work. So the Americans said, well, we have to do the deal with the guy who's there, the collaborationist regime. And it was a guy called Admiral Darlan, who was number 2 in the Vichy regime. And to the British, this was appalling. To Anthony Eden in particular, the Foreign Secretary, this was everything that we were supposed to be fighting against. We were doing the deal with somebody who's collaborating with Hitler. This would undermine everything that they were trying to achieve after when the war comes to an end as well. And so they're presented with this problem. And the problem is removed by an assassination on Christmas Eve, 1942. Now, it's still sort of shrouded in mystery what happens, but there are a fairly reasonable account that it could have been the British. So he's removed, and so you're left with a power vacuum over who's in charge of Allied controlled North Africa. And we have our man in London, Charles de Gaulle. The Americans don't trust him. They think he's a future dictator. They have an alternative candidate called Giroud, who's a kind of general, French general, a different general. And so there's this sudden panic that we might fall out. The Americans and the British might fall out over this question of the French future of France. And so we send in Harold Macmillan as our political representative. They send in their own version, the Americans, Robert Murphy. And then a Frenchman is sent in, Jean Monnet. And so there in North Africa, you have Charles de Gaulle, backed by Britain, Jean Monnet, who's on the payroll of the British. So he is paid by the British Civil Service, signed off by Winston Churchill, and dismissed by de Gaulle as way too Anglophile. Just a patsy for the British and the Americans. And this is the guy who becomes the great, anti-hero of the Eurosceptics. But he's our guy in a sense then. And he had proposed earlier on the formal union between Britain and France to continue to keep France in the war. He'd written that and proposed it, and it had been rejected by the Vichy regime. And so you have these figures, and Macmillan, de Gaulle, and Monnet. And there is no reason to think that de Gaulle was going to emerge triumphant. He was backed by the weaker party. Giroud had just as much of a claim as he did. But the force of personality and the force of Jean Monnet eventually leads to de Gaulle claiming the sort of the throne and becoming the future leader of France. And it is him as president who eventually vetoes Harold Macmillan's attempt to join. So these kind of figures, they play through history. But at the same time, across town, a young intelligence officer called John Enoch Powell is working. He's kind of sifting through the intelligence coming from the front lines. And he doesn't play a part in that kind of political struggle. But he becomes, over time, the figure that will battle back against what certainly Jean Monnet and Harold Macmillan represent. He will become the kind of founding father of Euroscepticism. And it's just this extraordinary coincidence that he's there at the same time as the founding fathers of Europeanism.
And the event that radicalizes Enoch Powell, and I mean, I enjoyed the whole book. It's 460 pages, I think. It's not small. But those opening chapters, particularly the opening chapter, were just really illuminating, really fun, really great history writing. The event that radicalizes Enoch Powell is Britain basically giving up its empire by giving India independence. And I think for lots of people now, this is only 80 years ago. It feels like another universe. But even just a couple of years before that happens, independence happens, you have Churchill and you have people in the British establishment talking about the British Empire lasting for centuries more. They're completely blindsided by it. So I want to talk about Powell in a moment. But this loss of the Indian Empire, how seismic an event is that for the sort of sense-making of the British elite after the Second World War?
Completely. I mean, I think, Churchill himself and Jean Monnet and Powell, they're all thinking, and Macmillan, they're all thinking in these terms. So in 42, where the book opens, you have Jean Monnet poring over maps of Europe. There are these accounts of him looking, in his study over these maps and sort of alighting on these areas of dispute between Germany and France and thinking we need to find a way to sort of federalize them, bring them together to bring peace. And people around him saying, "You're mad! Like this will never be signed off." And de Gaulle kind of raging against this, and de Gaulle then saying, "We cannot have a future in which Britain and America will dominate Europe." And Jean Monnet is saying, "But we need to build something that's new because the Americans have America to fall back on, a continent, and Britain has its own world to fall back on." So Monnet and the others then are not thinking about the Britain that would eventually emerge, a kind of another European state alongside France and Germany, and in time not as powerful as certainly as Germany. They're thinking of Britain and its empire as a fact that will remain. And so that is part of the story, that they assume that Britain will not be a part, the same kind of part. Monnet is already thinking in terms of can they have an association of some sort? How do we lock the British and the Americans in? He talks about the three constituent parts of the free world or the Western world: America, the British Empire, and Europe. So that is how people assume it. Powell is in a different place altogether. Like he is. I mean, he obviously assumes that himself. But he goes beyond that in his kind of wildest fantasies. So he is saying, France is finished, Europe is finished, the British Empire remains, but he's talking about further conquest. So he wants to get, does he call it a Malta for the for Asia? Like he wants another part of Asia that can act as a protective shield against Australia and India. And India is his great obsession. He has this dream of being Viceroy of India, running India. And indeed, he turns down a promotion in North Africa that would have kept him in North Africa because he wants to go to India above anything. And he goes there. And essentially, the story of Powell in India is this total love affair, this kind of romantic fantasy that he builds about an Anglo-Indian civilization that is kind of that stands in opposition to America. America becomes his great enemy, and he writes this essay called 1943, which I include it in my book, and Simon Heffer in his biography has more extracts from it, and it's wild in its kind of fantasy, but it's this projection forward where the British Empire's main enemy will be the United States. And Powell, when he leaves India at the end of the war, he's thinking, and this is serious, of traveling to South America and Central America to train, to get a lie of the land for the inevitable future conflict, world war, that the British Empire is going to have with the Americans. And it's kind of astonishing today to think about that. And of course, that's why Powell, in a sense, always stands outside of the conservative mainstream. He was a or Russian sympathetic figure, Cold War skeptic, anti-American, Eurosceptic. So his Euroscepticism and his anti-Americanism kind of go together, and they're understandable in that sense. But India is absolutely fundamental to all of these ideas. And when India gains independence, Powell is so lost that he just walks around London in a daze. All of his dreams gone, shattered. This idea that he's going to become viceroy, and that is the moment where he turns from an imperialist, committed imperialist, into a post-imperialist. And I think that is a fascinating thing about post-war British history, is the sense of Britain as a post-imperial nation. And Powell, and I was speaking to our culture editor at the New Statesman, Tanjil Rashid, about this. He was saying, in one way you could think about him as a kind of post-imperial academic, or in a way that anti-imperial academics would be as well.
Yeah.
And that is his turn towards England, because it starts with India.
Yeah, it's really strange. I've thought about this as well, the sort of parallels between, and this is going to sound outlandish, the parallels between somebody like him and Frantz Fanon, because this is happening at the exact same time, obviously very different political expressions, but responding to the same thing. But at the same time as that, I read Powell as somebody who's, maybe this is a primitive way of understanding politics and politicians, but we have certain personality types. And I think you use the word fixated. He's fixated 1 minute on imperialism, and then he becomes fixated on British nationalism. And he's clearly somebody who looked for certainties in life, moral, political certainties in life.
Absolutely.
And he moved from one to the other quite quickly.
Multiple times. Because he also he falls in love with the German language and Nietzsche.
Yes. And
then the Second World War causes him another total collapse in faith. Same with imperialism. There is a story in Heffer's book about a girlfriend as well who rejects him. Can't ever speak to her again. It's the break has to be total, absolute, and as he would see it, kind of utterly logical. So my conception of him is that, in a sense, he builds a fantasy and then builds logic on top of the fantasy. So the logic is sort of, in his word, it has to be absolute, and you have to follow it through academically. But to me, it's always built on a mirage, a fantasy that he has created, whether it's British imperial, Anglo-Indian civilization being a thing, anti-Americanism, British power, German romance, whatever it may be, and then eventually British nationalism.
Which is really kind of antithetical to how conservatism is meant to operate as not as an ideology, but as a sort of political worldview. I'll finish with Powell on this because, when you talk about all these figures in that first chapter, again, I don't know what the footnote is, it's something to the effect of, this is history. It's very much at odds with the world of the late 90s, the early 2000s. These are really he's not a world historic figure. I mean, de Gaulle probably is. But really, historic figures with a sense of massive political agency and a sense of history and acting within history, which we certainly haven't had in politics in this country for quite a while, although I suspect that's now changing. He was the youngest professor in the British Empire, is that correct?
That's right, yeah. Professor of classics, I think, or chair of classics in Sydney.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's amazing stories of him sort of taking these like hover planes over the entire world to get to Sydney, and he's crossing sort of the British Empire. And so for this, you imagine this young 26-year-old imperialist, and he's going through, and he's a classicist, so he's going through all of these parts of the world that he has sort of dreamt about his whole life, and as far as he's concerned, they're coloured pink. And then he arrives in Sydney. And then from that moment, he's agitating to come back, and he's writing these letters home to his parents. And the fascinating thing that Heffer concludes is that Powell was looking to die. So this is Powell is looking to become a martyr. He is explicit about this, and he's reading these poems, and he is writing, and he wants to fight and die for the cause. And Heffer concludes that Powell never got over the fact that he didn't die fighting for the British Empire in the war. And in fact, he effectively thinks that he missed the war. They didn't see any fighting because he was an intelligence officer. And I just psychologically, I've always wondered with Powell, and this is hopefully not too cod psychology, but that sense of looking to become a political martyr, having not achieved actual martyrdom as he would have wanted it, and to do that, you have to do it for an extreme cause, or as he would say, it's kind of purity. So he is seeking that, and he seeks it through these kind of twin ideas of Euroscepticism, nationalism, and anti-immigrationism.
And it's that sort of quest for purity, and there's clearly throughout his entire political career a sense of self-sabotage.
Yeah.
The compulsion to it, and I think a lot of people don't really think about this. If he didn't have that, he probably would have been a Conservative leader, if not Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. But that sense of self-sabotage just completely plagued him. That loss of India, and I think that story you tell of him travelling the world in the way that he does, as a new Roman, just landing on bits of pink on this across this world empire, that just vanishes, which is just an extraordinary thing to consider. How people just reflect on themselves as people in the world, and all of a sudden that's taken from literally hundreds of thousands of quite privileged people. I don't mean privilege as we think about it today, but political, economic, cultural privilege. That goes. And it's just extraordinary to think, all that happens, that you lose India and so on. But then this perennial consideration of British politics for my entire life, your entire life, and long before that as well, of influence.
Yeah.
This vague thing of influence, which I've never really understood. You want influence to surely achieve certain objectives. For the left, that will mean some things. For the right, that will mean other things. But actually, for much of the political class, just the idea of influence is in itself a good thing. It's something we should pursue. It should be at the centre of political life. And for many people, that's why we should be in the European Economic Community from 73. Where
I know I've sort of let the cat out of the bag saying about India, but where else does this come from? And when does it start? Is it purely a sort of post-imperial fact? Is Britain unique in having a political class which is so fixated with this abstract idea of influence?
It's a great question because I don't think we're entirely unique in that you can detect certain similarities with France, I guess, but of course they start from a different place. And I think this is the point about thinking of post-war Britain as a kind of post-imperial nation with post-imperial struggles, trying to work out how on earth to kind of navigate this and what should be its policy. And you think about how Europe began, the kind of Monnet's federal Europe. And I think this is absolutely crucial. Because if you think, why did it come about? Why did it come about so quickly after the Second World War? This is a continent in ruins, economically struggling, or in a desperate place. Britain, obviously indebted and no longer as as powerful as it was, but still a victorious country and by far the richest country in Europe, with this empire to fall back on, and obviously that starts to go quite quickly. But there's that is still a strong position with the United States and then the Soviet Union, and this is what changes, is that the United States is drawn into Europe for a couple of reasons. Britain says it can no longer defend Greece and Turkey. And so the question then is kicked over to the Americans. What are you going to do? Are you going to defend it, or are you going to allow it to fall to the Soviet Union? And then you get the Truman Doctrine, which we will step in and we will defend basically democracies or more cynically just the West. We will defend Western territory. And so the Americans are drawn in. They're also drawn in with the Marshall funding, Marshall aid. And they are looking, and you hear echoes today. They are saying, we're about to bail you out. We are not going to allow you to start fighting over tariffs among yourselves and protectionism or, sort of squandering the money. We're going to put this money in. And then you've got the Cold War and you've got the Soviet Union there. And so the challenge becomes the money coming in, we're defending you, we're paying for your economic restoration. Oh, and we need Germany back. Because without we can't turn Germany into this agrarian hole in the middle of Europe, as some of the French and the British had sort of thought about, and the Americans. We can't do it. We need German divisions again.
Why?
Because essentially they don't want to have to do it all themselves.
Yeah, and they need this against the USSR.
They need this against the Soviet Union. So Germany has to be resurrected as an industrial and military power to bolster the West against the Soviet Union. And so that immediately sets off the panic in France. What are they going to do about it? Now, what has France always done about Germany as a bigger power on its doorstep? It's had an alliance with Britain. That's its traditional method. Obviously, First World War, Second World War. Something changes here. So you have Monnet and his plan. And then the biggest change, though, is American power. American power steps in and it says to France, we can protect you. So we encourage you to take this step with Germany, to federalize coal and steel, and to put some of your sort of war-fighting materials beyond your control in a supranational authority as dreamt up by Monnet. And Monnet calls this finding a solution from a crisis, or it's extracting a policy from a need is how he puts it. And the question then becomes for the French political class: do you abandon your traditional alliance because now you can afford to with the Americans? And so, in a sense, you can't think about Europe without thinking about America and the Cold War. America is the creator of the Europe that becomes the EU. And that is fascinating because that suddenly presents Britain with a problem. Well, what the hell do you do now? How do you respond to this world where you've pulled out of Greece, you've pulled out of Turkey, you can no longer defend countries, you require the Americans to do it, and you can no longer veto what's happening on the continent. because the American power means that your veto is meaningless. It's their wider interests. And so I guess that's where the sense of, well, we're still richer than them. We don't need them. And also, let's be less cynical. You have a Labour government that has nationalised things like coal. This is, this is what the left have been pushing for years: democratic control over key industries. Miners are being paid more in Britain than they are in the continent. Their living standards are better. And suddenly you have a Labour government with the power of Parliament behind it, able to nationalise things and do things that nobody has dreamt of before. And you're asking at that point for that Labour government to limit that power and give it to a supranational authority, share power with the French and the Germans who want to then level the playing field, which would probably threaten, workers' pay at that point, and ultimately limit the power of democratic socialism. And that is the argument that is then put forward strongly by the left of the Labour Party. You cannot do this, and it should just be said, I think, that when we go back to that Hugo Young book that I mentioned, the generally accepted account now among the sort of British establishment is that this was the terrible mistake, that we should have got in from the beginning and we could have changed Europe to however we wanted it. And of course, there's some truth in that a lot of people say that we did have the power to influence Europe, but we had to accept the principle of supranationalism. We had to put beyond national control something that was currently held by a Democratic Socialist Party. That, I think, is essentially impossible at that time. And I don't think the Conservative government would have done it either. And it's this question of influence then over America. They are now clearly the superpower, and it becomes, how do you influence the Americans? So you can't go into Europe. You're no longer the world superpower. Or what you do have is this relationship with the Americans. You've got Macmillan, who knows Eisenhower directly. We know all of these figures. We've been allies. We've fought under their command. This was the dream, that we can run this thing. We can sort of pass the baton on, and then sort of help run the next empire. And obviously that sort of just drains away over time.
Yeah, and I think there is that sort of, like you say, this critique of if only we joined the European, coal and steel organization, the ECSC, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I think yeah. A-level politics, maybe not. And then, of course, 57, 58 with the Treaty of Rome. I think it really is understated the extent to which two things: we didn't lose the war, right? That European project is born out of defeat. And then secondly, like you say, Labour have had a programme since the, let's say, early 1920s. Imagine that people watching this, they're on the left. Imagine if you have a programme and you're in a political organisation, you have a tendency for 40 years, and you literally achieve everything in a single parliament. People say, oh, well, they only won they won 2 elections, but they were only in office for 6 years. Kind of doesn't matter. You can be in parliament for 1 year. If you get everything you want through, it's pretty extraordinary, and that's kind of what happened.
Of course, and the right, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, spend the next 30 years trying to unpick it.
Yeah. And parts of this still, NHS or whatever, it's still kind of...
Yeah, of course. And this is, I just, going back and putting yourself in the mind of the people that are making the decisions at the time is it's kind of wonderful to try and do it. And you do get this completely different perspective when you're reading like Tribune in 1956 or whatever, and Nye Bevan is writing these sort of polemical essays about why you cannot sign up to the Treaty of Rome. And you see the logic. And obviously we now live in this completely different world where Euroscepticism is generally associated with the right and pro-Europeanism generally with the left. And that can be for perfectly good reasons as well. But back then, let's not assume that the left had lost its mind. These were like sort of great figures of socialism, great socialists who see it as a threat to their ability to to achieve what they want to achieve.
You talk about the 1975 referendum, which is this referendum having joined the EEC. And there's this great line where you talk about left-wing activists calling people that are campaigning for us to stay in the EEC, they're calling them fascists.
Yeah.
And it's reminiscent of today. You'd hear that said about, the other side, by the other side. And so the names and the tactics don't necessarily change, but the targets do.
I think my favourite quote is, what is it when they say, when the 73 vote goes through and the left of the Labour Party start to rage against the right, who have jumped in with Heath to vote for entry, and they go, rat fuckers.
Yeah.
And again, you can't. It's hard to put yourself in that position, but that was the divide back then.
Yeah. So the 75 referendum, what is that like? Because of course, Britain's membership of the EU now, we think of the 2016 referendum with a very different outcome. You look at the 75 referendum, it's basically the entire establishment says we want this thing, and they win, which kind of doesn't really happen anymore. So how does that work?
It's a good question. I mean, there's a great book about this by Robert Saunders called Yes to Europe on the 75 referendum itself. And it just lays out the extraordinary imbalance between the two campaigns. As you say, they had the entire establishment, but they had high quality kind of campaign, cutting edge at the time. They get them in from America, these people who, these kind of advertising execs, and they pay them eye-watering sums. But of course, the other side, they're not as skillful as the vote leave protagonists years later. They're disorganized. They have very little resource. They are divided between, your Powells on one side and your Foots on the other. So all of that plays into it. But I think the other thing that plays into it is we'd only joined 2 years earlier in 73. Now, sort of the great hopes that there would be a tremendous boon from economic boom from joining, they'd kind of turned to dust quite quickly under Heath anyway, and not because of Europe, and not because of Heath even, but because of an oil crisis. The 73 oil crisis. So there's lots going on, and there is a sense of almost like regret now. There were these polls that suggested that people were a bit sort of disappointed by entry. But also, you have to think about that kind of sense of recent history. You had programs at the time that were airing huge documentaries, World at War, about the Second World War. This was in living memory. So the idea of coming together for peace was still extremely powerful. Do you remember when David Cameron tried to deploy the argument in 2016, talking about not wanting to go back to war in Europe? It was kind of almost dismissed, laughed at as a desperate last bid. Back then, it wasn't desperate at all. It was real. It felt real. But so did British decline. British decline felt real in the 70s. Now, I think now we can see the sense in which, well, what did decline mean? What does the decline mean in 75 when living standards were going up way more than they're going up today? Every year, living standards are improving, but the sense of decline and the sense of imperial decline, global decline was real, and of course it was true as well. And so you'd had moments like Suez Crisis not long previously, and so you'd had this change, and I think you're then asking the country to kind of whip it away quite quickly, and I don't think they blamed the current state, the state that they felt, the kind of anxiety they felt, the decline that they felt. They didn't blame it on European membership, of course, because it wasn't caused by European membership. It was caused by deeper problems. So I think the context between 75 and 2016 is totally different. And also you had in Harold Wilson, a very skillful operator who was more skillful than certainly David Cameron. David Cameron copied a lot of what Wilson tried to do. Wilson was this figure from the left he had come from the left. He was also a figure of the Eurosceptic left. These terms that I'm using, they weren't used at the time. They weren't known as Eurosceptics, but that's what he was. He had very little affection for Europe. He talks about at one point, why would we sell our Commonwealth? What did he call them? Kith and kin, essentially. Why would we sell our Commonwealth kith and kin down the river for the marginal advantage of selling washing machines in Dusseldorf? That's how he saw Europe. Like, maybe it'd be worth it, but I wouldn't do it if it means undermining our ties to Australia, New Zealand, and etc. So he had a certain respect, I guess, that this was a man who was a Eurosceptic who had tried to revive Britain with his vision of a kind of his vision of democratic socialism, I guess, a kind of a modernist democratic socialism, the white heat of technology and all of that, and that had failed. And Heath had failed. Everyone had failed, and he had come kind of reluctantly to the conclusion that Europe is the next best answer. And so I suppose the country was listening to him.
Do you think we were always going to leave the European Union? Because that's kind of the sense I get reading the book. I mean, I was always a Eurosceptic. I voted to remain, but I was a Eurosceptic. But I was a pragmatic one, I think. And I always believed that basically the entire political class was deceiving the electorate about what European integration actually meant. But it does kind of feel like after the Cold War ends, especially, it was just a matter of time before we left, really. What's your read on that?
I'm not quite there. I'm sort of, and obviously I've thought about this question a lot because people will ask me, so was it inevitable? Was it always pointless? Should we have not joined, or should we have? What is my overall takeaway? And I suppose I hope I'm not trying to dodge it, but after the Cold War, what very quickly happens is that Britain gets a different relationship with Europe to everybody else. And I think this is something that is often missed in this conversation now. In that the Cold War ends, Germany unifies, and the single currency is begins. So it obviously doesn't come into force straight away. It comes into force later on in the decade, but the seeds of it are sown in Maastricht. So you have Maastricht, the first treaty, the first great sort of leap forward.
Is it 91 or 90?
So that was 1991, so not long after Margaret Thatcher has left. And so John Major is Prime Minister. And John Major has, as Chancellor actually, under Thatcher, had manoeuvred so that Britain entered the European exchange rate mechanism, this sort of forerunner to the euro. Now, the crucial thing about Maastricht is that John Major negotiates an opt-out from the single currency. Now, at the time, we should remember, it was really considered a kind of opt-in. Britain would have the ability to opt in at the time of its choosing. So it wouldn't go in with everybody else into the single currency, but it could go in when it wanted to. And at first, this was seen as a sort of great negotiating triumph of John Major, and it was supported by most of his most of the party at first. But what it does is it creates a completely new relationship with Europe. So if you think from 1973 until Maastricht, Britain had the same relationship with Europe as France and Germany, and the two major powers, and everybody else. We'd had the same terms of membership, effectively. Now, what happens in 92 is that we enter into something new. We don't go into the central organizing new force in Europe, the single currency. And so you create a system where you have a single market and a single customs union, but you have a separate single currency. Now, the European Union is clear over time that single currency is the currency of the European Union. And of course, it's an attempt to create a single market with a coherent single market with a single currency. But Britain being separate, some historians will consider this Brexit 1.0. This is the point at which we step outside into a new relationship that is fundamentally fraught. Because what happens, and becomes the great existential fear of the British establishment, what happens if the single currency, the members of the single currency, come together and set the rules of the single market in their favour? And so what do we do about this? And John Major essentially tries to have it always. He tries to argue, well, we must be at the heart of Europe, but but then he negotiates Britain's, to be not at the heart of Europe, to be to the side. Tony Blair inherits that same situation. And it's from this moment, really, that what you have is, and again, this comes back to political organisation. You have this party called the Referendum Party, which we can understand in some ways as a forerunner to UKIP and now Reform, set up by Jimmy Goldsmith, a multi-millionaire, maybe a billionaire, Eurosceptic businessman. And what he does, which is incredibly significant, is he wrestles out of John Major and Tony Blair a commitment that they won't go into the euro without a referendum. And that, in a sense, is a hurdle that no pro-European government has ever been able to jump over. It's too high. The skepticism in the country is too high. Now, of course, there are moments you could say that Tony Blair there could have been a different history. Tony Blair was he powerful enough in those first years, or more pertinently, perhaps, should he have ever given that pledge on the referendum? Was he always going to win? Did he panic? Does it show a certain weakness, a lack of ideology? And I think this comes back, and again, to I think is a fascinating question ideologically, because we think of modernisation, both for the Conservative Party and Labour, as a kind of tool of, obviously of modernity, but sort of dragging the party into the centre. Do we think of that in some senses? Now, modernisation is often a way of saying, well, we need to appeal to Middle England. And Blair talks about sort of going into an overdrive to reassure Middle England. But modernisation is also, in his view, about moving away from kind of old Labour, socialist Labour and Eurosceptic Labour of Michael Foot and all of that. So it's moving the party right, and it's moving the party towards Middle England. He also sees modernisation as moving towards pro-Europeanism. But pro-Europeanism is not the position of Middle England, or it wasn't then. So modernisation carries like an inherent contradiction that he never really is able to deal with. He sees modernity as being inherently European and in some senses American. And he hopes that Britain, he gives this astonishing speech in 1998 where he says, Britain will be the beacon of modernity for the whole world. Like we will represent it. But then he's having to deal with the fact that the country doesn't think of modernity in exactly the same way as him. And I think you also get a similar story with the Conservative Party. We now think of modernisation, a Tory modernisation, as dragging it to the centre. The modernisers on the Tory side all came from the Eurosceptic Thatcherite right. And what they sought to do is to protect that bit of ideology by making the party more palatable to modern Britain. This is not the same as what the sort of centrist analysis suggests it is today.
So that's really, really interesting. We can look at those contradictions, which is a really fascinating formulation you just said about Blair there. I mean, that must really hit where it hurts if Tony Blair is watching or listening, which I doubt, but you never know. Maybe we'll put it as a social clip and he'll see it. But also this idea that between the end of the Cold War and that Euro opt-out, that creates a different path dependency for Britain's relationship with the EU. I totally buy that. And then, of course, you've got this, people make conditions, but under conditions of their own. People make history, but not under conditions of their own making.
Great stuff.
James Goldsmith, right? Like this dude has loads of money. He's like, you know what? I don't like the euro.
Oh.
He potentially changes
British history. I mean, there's so many variables. But
Absolutely, and this is what I found so fascinating going back through history. Hopefully, with I'm going at this with an open mind. I don't have a position on Brexit. It just wasn't the most interesting thing for me to just like relitigate the arguments, but just sort of how does history work? How does this happen? How do we go from 1997, where Tony Blair is this sort of all-powerful figure? There's cartoons of him like walking on water. There's a brilliant one. I can't remember in which newspaper. I think it might be the Times, where he's walking on water, having just signed the Good Friday Agreement. But in the background, there's a little ship on the horizon that looks like the Titanic. I think it's pretty prescient kind of cartoon. But how do you go? How do these things work? And then there are like assassinations, which change history. And the guy who assassinated Admiral Darlan in 1942 is this young, romantic French royalist. With these kind of visions of protecting France, and he does change history through that act. It's kind of extraordinary, these things that happen. But Goldsmith is one of them, and Goldsmith is, I mean, you could easily write a book about Goldsmith himself. The sort of the wildness of his life. But I sort of urge readers, listeners, to check out a couple of books that he wrote. The most important, I think, is called The Trap, that he releases in the mid-90s. And to read it today is to almost like hear the future contours, or can you hear contours? Hear Donald Trump, essentially. You see the contours of the future right. It is an anti-globalization, anti-free trade, pro-regional blocs, pamphlet that sort of says Maastricht is bad in his view because it's free trade, and it's going to destroy industry in the West at the benefit of the wealthiest people in what he would consider the third world at the time. And it's absolutely central. So it's not understandable without thinking about the end of the Cold War, because its entire frame is that these countries that were part of a sort of a world divided in two are emerging in their own right in Asia as powers. And he sees a world where you have sort of depressed, hollowed out cities, and then he also talks about climate and mass migration. He talks about all of these things. It does much better in France than it does in Britain.
wow.
Because the right in Britain are all Thatcherites, and they sort of dismiss his book as protectionist. And he stands in 1994 in France to be an MEP, and he wins. Nigel Farage, I think this is right, stands in 1994 and loses in Britain. And Farage is a traditional Thatcherite on these questions. But Goldsmith sets out a totally different, and it is just completely fascinating to read his account. I mean, it might be completely economically illiterate. I don't know, but it's sort of it certainly sounds like Donald Trump, like listening to it, and he does talk about things that kind of sort of the unhappiness with the status quo that will come about. So I thought it's fascinating, and he just uses his money to set up this party called the Referendum Party, and he employs these Eurosceptics who had been Thatcherite ultras in the 1980s, working in conservative student politics, and he brings them in, and he gets this pledge. He gets this pledge, which I do think probably certainly contributes to a change direction for Britain when it comes to Europe. I think if you go into the euro at that time, it's very hard to come out. Now there are accounts, and this becomes impossible to prove. Right, somebody like Ed Balls, really against the single currency, will say if we'd have gone into the single currency, and then we would have had the crash in 2008, the levels of austerity required to stay in the single currency, you'd say, thinking about Greece or whatever, would have been such that the British public never had a depth of Europeanism that they would have allowed it to happen. So Britain would have left. people then come back and say, well, Britain was so much bigger than Greece, the Europeans would never have allowed Britain to leave. All of that then becomes these kind of branching histories that are impossible to predict. But I think I personally think there's some kind of essential truth there, that without the political commitment of a country to a project, then it's always going to be fragile. And that's where the politics comes in. And that's where sort of the questions that you and I were talking about from the beginning about, the importance of ideas and projects and these people who come to embody them and try to change the direction of the country, that all of that starts to matter.
Yeah, this is something I find a lot speaking to left-wing Eurosceptics on the continent, particularly Italy. And I know, Italexit is a minor thing amongst some Italians, but they will say two things. One is we can't leave because the costs of leaving the Eurozone would just be enormous. I mean, there's a similar argument, well, the costs for the Eurozone of Italy leaving would also be enormous. So, Then there's another one, which is we just want to be a normal country, right? Which you always hear from Southern Europeans. I'm not saying this is some bigot. This is literally what they say to me. We just want to be like the Germans. We just want to be like the Brits and the Scandinavians. And they're associated, rightly or wrongly, membership of European Monetary Union with being a quote-unquote normal Northern European country. Obviously, Britain never had any of that. And I think it's really, really key. So we can talk about, I think you're right. I think clearly James Goldsmith is a massive variable. Blair offering the referendum, massive variable. Cameron's sort of, let's be quite frank, poor political management on this, a variable. But I think, sort of looming above all of it is the fact that the British public was in a very different place to the publics of places like Spain, Italy, Greece. Let's talk about Dominc Cummings. Because I think you've said, and just to reiterate, the book's called The Trap by James Goldsmith, which I've not read. He's a really captivating figure in this book. Another one, of course, is Dominc Cummings and Nigel Farage. Let's start with Cummings, though. Where does he come from? What's he doing before he becomes this, this Mephisto of Euroscepticism?
Yeah, so he's fascinating. There's another recurring character in this book, which is this guy called Norman Stone. And he is an academic, a conservative academic who becomes very close to Margaret Thatcher. He's one of the academics that she will ask for advice for speech writing, and she will bring him into conferences to advise her on the end of the Cold War and the unification of Germany. And he's a wild academic, like drunken, completely kind of outrageous behavior. And he leaves Cambridge in 75, I think. Maybe it was later. He leaves Cambridge University and joins Oxford in the 80s. And there he becomes this kind of figure of great respect for conservative-leaning students, and certainly those who want a kind of iconoclastic conservatism, sort of funny and clear and not wet, as they see it. And so he draws to people. He draws these certain type of individuals to him. Michael Gove is drawn to him. A guy called Patrick Robertson, who sets up the Bruges Group, and then eventually joins James Goldsmith as his right-hand man. And then the figure of Dominc Cummings. And Dominc Cummings becomes very close to Stone. He becomes this kind of intellectual icon. And the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, people like Stone and a load of young students are flocking to Russia, because for Stone it's a treasure trove. Get into the archives in the Kremlin, and you make your name for yourself. And he's so frustrated with Oxford. He hates Oxford. He thinks it's snobbish and self-satisfied and slow and bureaucratic. And he just flies out there, and he's trying to get sort of Hitler material, basically. And he's sending these notes back to Cummings, who he is tutoring, and saying, "You've got to come here. Like this is the place." And at the time, this did become a place for loads of young people. It's like the Wild West. to go and make a fortune, make their name for themselves, see something, see history happening. So Cummings he finishes his degree and he goes to Russia. And he, out there, he meets another of Norman Stone's friends. Norman Stone is friends with Lord Salisbury, who is a very influential figure in Conservative politics. He had become influential in the major government. He was a kind of mover and shaker, the last of this great aristocratic Tory family. And his daughter, Izzy, happened to be going out to Moscow as well. And Stone says to Cummings, can you look out for her? Can you just keep an eye on her for me? And so they meet up, they become friends. And this, I'll come back to that in a minute, why that's important. Cummings then spends a few years there. He tries to set up this airline in southern Russia. And he has this great idea that all of these Americans will fly into Russia and they can bypass Moscow airport, which is dangerous and it's all getting crazy. And they can just fly into this former closed city. And he can set up this airline and, obviously make his fortune. And it doesn't work. And Cummings says that he got fucked over by, I can't remember who he says he got fucked over by, various, corruption and other rival airlines and things. And I'm sure he did. And he comes back to Britain and he tries to study for the bar and he hates it and he's bored. And he goes to a party at Lord Salisbury's house. With Izzy, who's he's friends with. And he meets Lord Salisbury and Salisbury says, oh, if you're bored, I'm setting up this new thing. It's called Business for Sterling. And Business for Sterling is the genesis of Vote Leave. It is the original campaign group that is fighting against British entry into the euro. And Cummings joins it. And he joins it alongside some other figures, a guy called Rodney Leach, who is married to a woman called Jessica Douglas Hume, who was a former girlfriend of Roger Scruton.
And she's the daughter of Alec Douglas Hume, the Tory PM.
Not daughter, can't remember
She's
the exact
relative,
connection,
yeah.
relative of a former editor, ex-wife of the former editor of the Times who died as well. So very well connected. So it's a very well connected Tory group. But they have created to stop Britain going into the euro and to stop the sense of inevitability, which they're fundamentally fighting. And this is, again, this point about history, that there is inevitability. You can't fight it. This is where we're going. And Cummings joins this group. And that is the beginning of his political campaigning. And it's from there that he runs. He sets up various other think tanks over the way, but and campaign groups. He fights the referendum against the North East Assembly, and I think that is another sort of foundational moment in this story. But you see the connections. That's what I tried to do in the book. You see the connection from Cummings through Stone, through Scruton, through Thatcher, through Powell. All of these characters, they're all kind of connected.
Yeah, and that campaign for stopping the Assembly for the North East of England, the campaign plays quite hard and loose, fast and loose is the term maybe, with the figures in terms of this. We all save X amount of money to do Y, and of course we see that again in 2016 with leaving the European Union will give us £350 million to the NHS. We don't have to litigate whether that's true or not. The numbers with regards to the North East Assembly, they looked quite dodgy.
Yes, yeah.
That's campaigning, but they do look quite dodgy. And obviously,
I think they clearly are. But again, anybody interested, go and read about the North East Assembly campaign. Great white elephants and stunts with money being burnt. Would you rather this was used on creating this house for more politicians or for doctors and nurses?
It's sort of like that campaign is the Protean Vote Leave campaign, and James Goldsmith is the Protean Farage Mark II.
Yeah,
super interesting, and I think that's why. I mean, okay, it's history, but it's I think I tweet about the book and I said, history's never over or never forgotten. What's the quote? History's not even. Yeah,
history is now.
Yeah, it's not the past, right? We're living in the shadow of all of this, which is really, which is why it's a relevant political book as well as a history. I'll finish with this one. Farage seems to be a bit of a non-entity, really, until the late 1990s, until the 1999 European election. If Blair doesn't change the way by which we elect MEPs in this country, of course, for that election, it was the first time that we had single transferable vote, a more proportional system for voting for members of European Parliament. If Blair doesn't change that system, we probably don't get Farage voted in as an MEP, at least in that election.
Almost certainly.
And we probably don't get UKIP as we understand it. I mean, there's two questions there. How seismic is that decision to create a STV system for European elections in 1999? And then secondly, Nigel Farage, at what point do people realise, okay, this guy is actually a political phenomenon? Because we're talking about a guy in 2025, the bookies have him as the favourite to be the next Prime Minister. He may not be. We never know. But that's a remarkable transformation in 25 years.
Yeah, I think you start to see Nigel Farage in British politics in around 92. Interestingly, his first interaction for UKIP is to be a chauffeur for Enoch Powell, chauffeuring him down to a by-election in which I think Alan Sked is standing as the leader of UKIP at the time. Although it may have been called something else then, it changes its name. And we'll see this, how this story plans out. Farage is always thinking about the new branding, Brexit Party, and he has this idea to call UKIP Reform very, very early. It's his sort of, it's always been his idea. He writes about it in one of his books saying, if I were able to have got reform, it would have rung down the ages, he says. It's so weird to go back through this story and you hear these kind of bells that you just suddenly, they sort of start ringing and you think, God, how did that happen? 30 years ago. And Farage is fascinating because Farage, Michael Crick's biography of Farage is very good. Farage is an extraordinarily right-wing student at Dulwich College. He was scrawling NF on walls, which had an obvious double meaning. He was provocative, purposely provocative. Lots of students just think he was an outright racist. This was Nigel Farage, and they recommend that he doesn't go to university, that he goes into the city. He's a generous description would be that he is a kind of provocative Jack the Lad who is drawn to very right-wing politics. And he goes to see a lecture from Enoch Powell at Dulwich and is bowled away. And he sees another one by Keith Joseph and he joins the Conservative Party. So that's Farage when he's younger. He then goes into the city, makes a bit of money, drinks a lot. And then he leaves the Conservative Party over Europe and Maastricht. And he starts to go to these events, Bruges Group events, and he eventually gets in at UKIP and then starts to volunteer. Then he stands and he gets a taste for it, and he thinks he's quite good at it, and he starts doing the speeches in town hall speeches and things like that. So he's sort of what do they call it, pounding the leather or whatever. He's sort of like he's knocking doors, doing his stump speeches. So he's practicing from a very early age, but he's getting beaten easily. He's getting like maximum 5% in the polls in these elections. And 1999 is the time that Tony Blair changes the electoral system, and he does it. Why does he do it? He does it because it's modernization. Go back to modernization. He is trying to modernize. He wants to create. He thinks the 21st century will be the progressive century, whereas the 20th century was the Tory century, and he's modernizing by trying to bring the Liberals into a grand left-wing coalition. And he absolutely central to this is Europe and electoral reform. And he basically wobbles on electoral reform and doesn't go there. I think he flirts with AV Plus, which is the alternative vote system. It's a kind of moderate form of proportional representation, and he rejects it. But as he's kind of modernizing Britain with devolution, Good Friday Agreement, and all of these other things, Bank of England independence, the Liberals are not getting enough from the deal, and they start to agitate. And the last hope that they have is that they're going to get some form of proportional representation for the European elections. And if they don't, it's probably the end of the working together. And so Blair intervenes, and he pushes it through. And it had been rejected in the Lords, I think. And Blair uses the Parliament Act to impose this rule. I mean, obviously, he would say it was democratically elected through the Commons. That is true. But it was very rare. He imposes it with the Parliament Act. And so it comes onto the statute book just in time. And from that election, you get not only Nigel Farage, who is the great benefactor of it, and you speak to him. And if you had him on this show, he would say what he said to me, which is that is the most important event in his life. Without that, nothing else happens. Again, these unintended consequences, branching histories, moments where people think that they are doing one thing, but they're actually creating the conditions for something entirely different. That is the part of the story. And of course, Blair makes similar decisions through his premiership. That without those decisions, you could argue, for instance, if Blair had been just far more conservative with a small c on some of these issues, that you would never have Farage, you would never have Eurosceptic support. Or you could argue that if he was far more progressive and less obsessed with modernisation, he would have followed a sort of John Smith agenda, and he would have been more transformative on the economy, more transformative on Europe, and less transformative on internal constitutional questions. And again, you wouldn't have had the rise of Farage. For Farage, he is this fascinating figure who burst onto the scene in 1999. But again, we should remember he doesn't do much for a long time, and it takes then 2004 and the increase in migration to really start to propel him up.
I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. If Farage does become the PM, that the thing that starts all of it is Tony Blair pushing a bit of legislation through the Parliament Act 30 years earlier.
Yeah.
That is really something.
He'd be a weird emblem of modernity, modernisation.
If you were to write a novel about the thing, you'd start with Blair having, a phone call with Paddy Ashdown, and it ends with, Farage walking through crowds to get into number 10. I mean, it's quite a remarkable timeline. So you mentioned migration there. It feels like there's two moments where migration just becomes this hugely salient transformational topic. It's not been an evergreen of British political debate. You have it in the 50s and the 60s, and then it kind of goes quiet. This country has when I was born in 1984, we have net emigration, I think, in this country. But you say 2004-5 is a major moment. And then, of course, we have the refugee crisis of 2015. Let's go to 2004-5. That's another Blair decision, isn't it? Yeah. To not insist on temporary initial caps on economic migrants from these new member states of the European Union. Talk about that for a moment.
Well, it's modernisation as well. So it's another. You can argue there's a sort of form of overcorrection, that he had not been able to do what he wanted to do, which was to fix the structural problem that he had inherited from John Major, which is to take Britain back into the heart of Europe, back into the single currency. That is his great goal. Let's not sort of forget that is his overarching strategic goal. That is the legacy. You take Britain back in, you lock the country in permanently, and you make it the, what he wanted, this beacon of modernity at the heart of Europe. You make it the most powerful country in Europe, and he had not found a way to do that. Now, a way of displaying your Europeanism, your pro-Europeanism, your commitment to Europe is also then comes in 2004 with this decision about whether you impose controls on migration coming from the Eastern European countries that were where the European Union expanded, and he makes this decision. Now, the strange thing is, when you go back and you try to understand how this decision was made, it was almost not made. It was just it just happened. So there was no great debate. There was no great controversy in cabinet. And also, this was a Blair who was being, sort of obsessive about illegal migration in Calais. We're thinking, I think we talked about Calais as we came in. These problems existed then, and he was kind of trying to be tough on that, and was tough on that. He kind of understood or he was I talked about sort of being in a constant state of reassurance about Europe. He was in that constant state of reassurance about illegal immigration, asylum, all these questions. And so this question just didn't come up. People thought, there were these studies that showed that there wouldn't be that big of a movement across the borders. They were a bit flawed, even people's understanding of them at the time. They were obviously wildly inaccurate. But it wasn't just that they were inaccurate. There was a premise, because people say, I think the Treasury or the Home Office say that only 8,000 people would come in the first year. Well, they didn't actually say that. They said that if every other country in Europe didn't have transitional controls, about 8,000 or something like that would come to Britain. So obviously, if that didn't happen, if they couldn't go to Germany, where would they go? They might come to the UK. But even then, they wildly underestimated it. But I think what you get is a combination of the Treasury thinking that it would be good for holding down inflation, the Foreign Office thinking it would be very important to win the support of these new countries to balance against the Germans and the French. So suddenly we had another tool in our toolbox to be able to control Europe, to have influence, and that would be Polish and New Europe support. So this was a diplomatic move, an economic move, and a move of just and the other thing that was explained to me, the Home Office said, we support this as well, because I don't want to have to manage a potentially massive influx of people into the country who could then go into the black market. We don't have the capacity to do that. So I'd rather they just had the legal right to do it. Because they could have come to Britain anyway. They could have come legally, because they were EU citizens, but they then couldn't have worked. So you can understand from the Home Office perspective. God, that's a nightmare. Yeah. So you've got this combination of what we understand today: lack of state capacity, a certain Treasury brain understanding of the economy and the importance of keeping inflation down, which should be in this perennial concern, and a diplomatic manoeuvre to have influence in Europe come together to create this system, create the decision in 2004.
I mean, but also that decision and how off it was, and I've got the numbers here. You talk about the numbers in the book. I mean, it feels to me that is the beginning of widespread distrust in the democratic system, because people, I think, in the early 2000s trust politicians generally. There's lots of scandals, there always have been, but they generally trust politicians to make a well-informed, good decision. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that is the first time where millions of people in this country say, actually, maybe not. Maybe it's not quite malicious. I think now people think those things are done maliciously, but I think there's a recognition that they got it wrong. So ministers were advised that Britain could expect between 5,000 to 13,000 new arrivals net per year. You've got this great line from David Blunkett, the Home Secretary, saying, when they start talking about 13,000, you just start blanking out. Yeah. And then we have the actual numbers, which is over the course of the next 7 years, so between 2004 and 2011. The number of people living in Britain who had been born in the EU would grow by more than 1 million, an average increase of 170,000 a year, much of that caused by large-scale immigration from Eastern Europe. So, 5 to 13,000 a year actually becomes 170,000 a year.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not suggesting that's good or bad. It has actually some really good aspects to it.
Yeah.
It has, one might argue negative aspects, because obviously the public haven't really consented to any of this and they've been misinformed.
Yeah.
But that just feels like, if you have already, for all the structural reasons we've talked about, a feeling that we're different to the continent, quite rightly, if you look at history, it feels like you're just pouring on kerosene with that decision.
Yeah, I think you said a number of really important points there. So if you think about trusting government, so you got to think when that was, 2004. That's not long after Iraq. And, obviously Afghanistan, 2001. But Iraq's the key thing, and the descent into hell and chaos that happens there, which robs Blair of any authority to be able to take Britain into the euro. he's no longer powerful enough. That vision of Blair as the one who can kind of bend history, he sees the future, he understands modernity, is shattered in the chaos of Iraq. And so I think that robs him of his legitimacy. And then you have those kind of moments as well with migration, where it's a kind of loss of control. It's a sense that, oh, no, you said this, and then that didn't happen. Actually, you're not this guy who sees and understands the future. I think it does another thing. When you talked about migration being an important, it had flared up, obviously, in the 50s and the 60s with Powell. What was Powell talking about then? He wasn't talking about European migration. He was talking about, he's talking in ethnic, racial terms. He's talking about non-white people. And he's explicit about this, right? He's talking about, he says at some point, if 1 million white Anglo-Saxon Protestants move to Britain from Australia, it doesn't matter. Because for him, it's like it's racial and it's cultural. And so he's not talking about numbers. He's not talking in terms of net and things like that. It's kind of technocratic language that we use today about net, the movement of people in and out of the country. He's talking in these very, very different terms, and he's thinking racially. And that's why, obviously, he gets sacked, rightly so. 2004, what happens? Immigration changes in the public's mind as a fear of non-white people coming in, or a concern, or to a concern about white Christian Europeans coming into the country. That's something different. It's changed into something that's linked to Europe. So if you think about Powell is obsessed with race and immigration and Europe. And what happens in 2004, Europe and migration come together, and it's disentangled from race as a question. I mean, I think you could argue, when Romania comes, there are clearly the kind of racist overtones, or explicitly racist overtones, then. But I think this key change of lack of trust, migration coming together with Europe in the public's mind, these two twin things, is like a really fundamental moment that then makes sort of powers Euroscepticism. And then you see these power-like figures, obviously most notably Farage, able to campaign on a power-like agenda that he can say is got nothing to do with race. It's about sovereignty. And so in a sense, it becomes less toxic. And in a sense, the right has always, not just the right, but the right and the left have always struggled with Farage. Because though he has a toxicity, it's never like Powell, because he's stayed away from the race question.
He will say, I've done more than anybody else to stop the rise of the BNP, because those energies, there's some truth to it, in so much as, the success of UKIP sort of taking off kind of maps on to some extent the BNP declining. Kind of true.
Sort of true. For a long time, actually, I was surprised that
2009, I think, right?
Yeah, for a long time, the Farage was very concerned that BNP would, overtake him.
Yeah, it looked very possible.
Yeah.
But, we're having this conversation now, and the book's fantastic. We've had a really fabulous conversation for 1 hour and 50. But the more we've been talking, the more I realised there's a conclusion that I didn't really draw out of the book, which is, and of course I would say this, I'm on the radical left, Tony Blair has so much to answer for, so much. He made so many mistakes of statecraft. Mm-hmm. And I think about this a lot. He's the leader of, even though he's the most successful Labour leader, Harold Wilson wins more elections, but I think, Blair, probably is more successful. They're bigger majorities. I don't think Blair could have done what Kinnock does, not that I agree with what Kinnock did, to the Labour Party in the 1980s. That required a person who was comfortable with ideological conflicts and political machinations in a way that Kinnock doesn't come from that part of the party. But he was happy for other people to do it. Mm-hmm. And Kinnock kind of cleans up and sanitizes the party. Blair inherits it. And then he does this thing, which is, like you say, modernization, which is completely, which means he keeps on making bad decisions with no sort of vision about where the country's meant to go. That combined with we have to reach out to Middle England, which doesn't like lots of the modernisation you're fixated with, creates this kind of really volatile political set of conditions, which we're now living in, let's be quite frank. And I really think, the more you've spoken about Blair, just the dangers of having people with lots of power who don't have any ideas, how they are just buffered around by events.
Not just Blair, is it, right now?
Well, quite. Not just Blair, exactly. Right now with Keir Starmer too. Of course, events buffer, they throw off all kinds of politicians, as happens with Thatcher after the demise of the USSR, or as it's ongoing, the demise of the USSR. But it's really clear with Blair, and now you've said it with Starmer as well. Let's finish with Starmer sort of briefly. You have some understanding of him as a politician, we all do, but you more so than most. He's been in the job for a year. Do you think he could be the Prime Minister that takes Britain out of the ECHR?
Yeah. I mean, I remember speaking to somebody very close to him, and I sort of put this to them because, you go back, don't you, and you say he won the Labour leadership by essentially promising Corbynism without Corbyn. Then he took the party to the right. Then he won the election promising one thing, and there is a sense that he could always shift. He can always shift, and he can shift without sort of being he almost takes offence that other people are offended that he's shifted. Of course, well, I've said that then, but I meant it then. But now I mean this, and I sincerely mean it. And I think to some extent it's sort of true. Like he's sincere in every moment of his insincerity. Like he sort of, and so I do wonder about the ECHR. But when I spoke to somebody who said, no, there's no way he would leave because he's human rights to his kind of core. He's just promoted Shabana Mahmood into the Home Office. Now, she is far more sceptical about it than he is. I mean, eye-wateringly so. So I don't rule anything out anymore. I mean, we're recording this as he's sacked Peter Mandelson from being ambassador to the United States 24 hours after he had backed him as ambassador to the United States. So I think he clearly has the ability to shift. I mean, the thing with Starmer is so fascinating when you think about his relationship with Europe is he's so apolitical and ideological that it's hard to know. So when he did his reset with Europe, he instructed his ministers to do something that basically none of the other politicians have done, which is just said, don't talk about it. Don't have a fight. Don't draw any red lines with the Europeans and beat them. Don't handbag them, as Thatcher did. Just don't bother. Just go into a technocratic negotiation, negotiate with them and come out with a deal. We'll present it to the country. And the strange thing that happened with that is that about 24 hours of bad headlines from the conservative press, and then now nobody cares. And so I have this kind of vision of him as sort of settling a relationship, but almost being a first sort of post-European prime minister, or or post-normal prime minister. We've had all of these figures in this book who have wrestled with these questions and have this vision of Britain as a great power, and they want to gain influence here and there and everywhere, and and it's so core to their being. And Starmer to me just looks like he could be the prime minister of any mid-sized European social democracy and sort of not interested in any of that. So that lack of caring about history and ideology makes him quite unpredictable to know where we're going to go. It clearly leaves him with an enormous hole in his government. We talked about Blair earlier, and there's I'd say Blair had an idea. It was modernity and globalization, and globalization was modernity. And the problem with Blair is that idea is completely shattered by events. Starmer doesn't, to me, have an idea, a clear idea. He's much more of a conservative figure. I once said to somebody who is very close to him, "Come on, you know him deeply. Tell me, like, if you peel away everything and you get to his core, like, what is it that fundamentally drives him?" And they said, "Oh, he's a social democrat." I thought, well, that's not the thing that burns in your soul, like, injustice or inequality or something that's sort of like, that drives you on. Nobody's driven on by being a moderate social democrat. That's sort of I don't know. It's just, there is not an idea. Somebody else says, it's human rights. Let's see. Because I'm with you, Aaron. I wouldn't be entirely shocked if we start seeing at least changes to Britain's relationship with ECHR.
Great place to end on. Tom, it's a great book.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And yes, it's 460 pages. I do recommend it. Really fabulous history writing. Thanks again.
Thanks very much for having me.